This is Dennis Money with Phil Goldberg, our guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Long. I really enjoyed it thoroughly. He's extremely knowledgeable, and obviously in terms of history and philosophy of Hinduism, and very articulate guy.
Oh yeah, that's one of the reasons I wanted him on. There are certain academics who are very attuned to the living nature of these spiritual traditions, and they bring to it, something that ordinary practitioners or clergy don't have, which is this scholarly training and familiarity with history and the original languages and the texts. So that combination is very, very appealing and very informative.
Right. There are people that would argue the other side of what I'm going to say, but for me, I think if I was going to take a course in Hinduism, I would rather take it from a practicing Hindu who has a scholarly background in Hinduism, rather than somebody who just has the scholarly background in Hinduism. And as I said, I mean, you could argue both sides of that, but there's a richness that comes through, and a certain amount of even passion for what they're discussing that I think would make the study of that religion more interesting.
Yeah, but you're hitting on the nature of the controversy that we brought up in the interview. Um, if you were interested if you were born in Asia somewhere and had not much exposure to Catholicism, say, or Judaism, and you came to the West, where would you go if you were curious to learn information? Would you go to a church or synagogue? Would you talk to a priest or a rabbi? Would you go and take a course in a university that may be taught by somebody who has no direct affiliation with the tradition because they're a philosopher or an anthropologist or a historian, and very secular, or maybe even atheist or something? Where would you get the proper perspective? Well, the truth is you probably get a best perspective from some combination of those things, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, because the scholar wouldn't know what
Right.
a cleric would know, and an ordinary practitioner wouldn't know what a scholar knows. And so that combination makes a lot of sense. There's scholars of Hinduism who are not practicing Hindus, but they really know the text and the history.
Right.
And sometimes their perspective on the text and the history is different from what a guru's would be, or a philosopher who's a practitioner.
Right.
So that variety of voices creates a certain degree of tension sometimes, but it's in the service of knowledge.
Right. I think also for me, the more I associated that particular religion with uh, practice, the more I would want to speak to somebody authentic. In other words, what I'm saying, when I think of Zen Buddhism, I think mostly of somebody sitting in meditation and being mindful or doing whatever the monks do. When I think of the Methodist branch of Christianity, I think maybe it would be easier to look at that academically than because there's less of spiritual practice associated with it. Now, there might be a lot more spiritual practice associated with the Methodist branch of Christianity than I know about, and
Right.
but so yeah, and I guess you're right. It would be a combination of things. But with some religions,
Yeah.
especially from the East, I would be more interested in learning from a practitioner. But that's
Yeah,
just me.
and I think you're hitting on something, because I think one of the things missing from what I see in the academic study of religion is it's so much dominated by the study of scriptures and texts. So it focuses on what are the beliefs and what was the the storytelling, and so forth. Um, and very little is done about the experience of the people practicing these traditions,
Right.
regardless of what the tradition is. So when you have a tradition like Hinduism or Buddhism that are so oriented around direct experience as opposed to beliefs and so forth, it makes it even more important to ask yourself, well, what do practitioners experience? How do they replicate that experience? So I would agree with you there.
Right. Also, if I'm a student at a university and I'm going to take an introductory course in comparative religions, and the one professor that's teaching it is an atheist. He just thinks it's all nonsense, but he knows the history and philosophy associated with it. There's no way that that person's going to teach it in the same way that somebody who is practicing a particular religion would teach it. On the other hand, if the person who is the practitioner and the believer was teaching it, it would be hard for them to be objective if one of those religions was the one that they most adhered to. So, I don't know.
Exactly.
I think you're exactly right. You have to really approach it from a few angles to get any kind of you know, good objective perspective on the study of religion.
Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with a tradition that has a lot of diversity within it. So, you know, you will find people who are very knowledgeable about the history of yoga and the history of Vedanta, the history of Hinduism, but they have a different angle on it because of the guru they studied with,
Right.
or the particular tradition or lineage that they were born into.
Right.
And they will debate with one another, even within the tradition, let alone insiders and
Right.
outsiders.
Phil, when you speak on your book, American Veda, you talk about many different branches or spiritual traditions within Hinduism, within Buddhism, just how these influences came from east to west. Are you ever, when you give your presentations, are there ever any people that say, unless you're a part of this particular tradition, how can you write about it? How can you talk about it?
Um, you know, Not that much because, well, I got a little of it in India. But people understand that, I was a practitioner first, and I
Hmm.
was deeply immersed in it. And the thing is, I'm not writing about Hinduism as such. Um, I was writing a historical book about how these teachings have influenced America. So it's not a treatise on Hinduism or Vedanta or yoga, although, I had to explain what those things are and why they're important. But so people weren't saying, oh, you shouldn't write about Hinduism, because I wasn't. I was writing about the effect of this on and the influence of it in America, and they understood that a journalist can do that. And I haven't had any difficulty with scholars either. Some scholars have said I was wrong about this or mistaken about that, or I left this out, and that's all legitimate because I'm sure there's truth in it. But at the same time, scholars understand that you don't have to be an academic to write something like what I did. Whereas if I had the audacity to write, a translation of the Upanishads without knowing Sanskrit,
That would be
then
something.
they would have a much
Yeah,
strong,
yeah,
reason to
right.
object.
And I say to our listeners, I recommend if you haven't read Phil's book, American Veda, read it because it's very important to understand how these influences that are part of our life now, integrated into our culture, into our thinking, weren't always here, and how they came from east to west. Along those lines, Phil, one of the things that Jeffrey discussed with us was, separating spiritual practices from Hinduism, for instance, and I guess we've seen a lot of that in the West. There's many different groups that have come out of Hindu backgrounds that teach different techniques, and usually those groups are guru centric, and so and many of those gurus have said you don't have to be a Hindu to get enlightened to practice these practices, and I guess that's an ongoing kind of, if not controversy, dialogue that goes on about
Yeah.
and I think different gurus even approach it in different ways.
Yes, and that's part of the conversation, and we didn't get into that, but a lot of Hindus who are disturbed that there are so many Americans who are dedicated to these practices and resist the label Hinduism. I think they don't completely appreciate the fact that we took the gurus who came here seriously, who said you don't have to be a Hindu to do this. And, this goes back to Vivekananda, who's a national hero in India, and Maharishi and Yogananda and all of the principal gurus said, these are universal teachings. You can be, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, whatever, and still use these teachings. And that's what I'm representing here. You don't have to be a Hindu. So that was our orientation and training. And so it's kind of understandable that, things would shape out the way they did.
Right. I had an experience of this directly. I went to a Hare Krishna temple to have their Sunday feast, and when I was there, I was actually surprised because I hadn't been to a Hare Krishna temple for
Yeah,
many,
you
many
like the
years.
free food.
The food is either free or yeah. Their Indian food I like. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, it's always very festive. They're very friendly, and what I noticed was about half the people there, out of 150 people, it was a big group, were Indians from India who had come to America, and the other half were not. They were just
Hmm.
the people who had been in the United States for many years, and so I was talking to everyone, kind of getting a feel for it. And apparently, the Hindus that come from India that come to the temple, they see it as a bhakti temple. They know how to take care of the deities, and
Hmm.
this is how they worship. Whereas the Westerners who came, many of them, who had grown up in the West, didn't necessarily consider themselves Hindus, but like the practices of
Hmm.
spirituality and the bhakti tradition that the Hare Krishna represented, and everybody seemed to feel comfortable with one another.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're the most Hindu of all the traditions that came here, all the lineages, all the gurus. They were the most Indian and the most overtly Hindu, and yet even among them, not everybody is comfortable saying I'm a Hindu. So it's a complicated thing, and to me, it's evidence of the kind of universality of the tradition that we do call Hinduism. That it has this of versatility
Mhm.
and this appeal to people in different ways.
Well, that
But we'll
was
take that up again another
another
time.
time, Dr. Jeffrey Long today. Very enjoyable, and to our listeners, we have some more great interviews coming up. So stay tuned. Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. Go to our Facebook page, like us on our Facebook page, subscribe, and we'll send you free information. And yes, get the word out and continuing to enjoy our shows. All
All
the
right,
best.
later.